My name's Adela and I make minis. This month I've challenged myself to make
100 vases in 100 days.
On day 22 I was inspired by some Middle Eastern jars from the Bronze Age. I'd seen these in the British Museum and I totally fell in love with their simple silhouette. They just have one smooth curve throughout with no sharp edges or a broken line, and I found it really visually pleasing, so I thought I would make my own but smaller. Once I was happy with how the body was looking, I moved on to the neck, which I joined with a small sausage of clay just to ease that transition from body to neck. Then I pinched out a small lip and moved on to the handles. These looked really great, but they were a nightmare to match up. It's that classic eyeliner situation of the first one's perfect and then the second one is just not happening. But we got there in the end. Once that was finished, I decided that this guy needed some decoration. So I went ahead and got out my white slip. Initially I went for some bold lines, but it wasn't really working. But as I was sponging the slip off, I started to see a cool effect, so I went all in and sponged the slip on instead, and it came out with a super interesting texture. I'm excited to see if this shows up once it's been fired, but you never really know how things are going to come out. I liked the shape from yesterday so much that I decided to carry on with it on day 23. I made the body a little bit larger and a lot more top heavy, which again was inspired by these Bronze Age vases that I'd seen. When I first attached the neck, I worried that it might be a little bit too narrow, but it fleshed out really nicely when I added my clay sausages. Then, once I'd pinched out my lip, I went back in and reshaped the body and the shoulder to be slightly narrower and more sloping, so that you have a really pleasing curve. This also helps to emphasise the top-heavy, rounded shape of the body. So once I'd hollowed out the bottom, I then moved on to the handles. My source image had really small and very low handles. They were well over halfway down the body, so I went ahead and added my own. Once that was all finished, I decided that I want to push the sponging that I did yesterday a little bit further. So this time, along with the white slip, I layered some black slip over the top. And I think it looks great. I'm super excited to see how this one turns out. It looks a little bit like it's been wood fired. Once I'd pinched out the two halves of my body, I went back and I trimmed down the top half as it didn't quite match up and it was a little bit too wide. I then went for a slightly longer neck than the other pieces this week, pinched out a little lip, and moved on to refining my body with my wooden tools and my fingers, just to make sure that everything's lovely and smooth. As I was doing this, I realised that the shape that I'd created reminded me a little bit of a torso with this long neck, and there was something about it that made me feel like this neck should be drooping slightly, like it's too heavy. And I had the image of these little flowers spilling out of the vase, and maybe they're the reason why this neck is so droopy. So I just bent it a little bit. Once I was happy with how that was looking, I moved on to the handles. Now, a good trick that I've learnt to tell if your handles are even is to turn the piece upside down. It gives you a fresh perspective and any differences or unevenness shows up really easily. Then it's on to the decoration. For this one, I went for white slip and some really simple, skinny, horizontal lines. And I think this guy looks great. I can't wait to see him all finished. And if you like him, don't worry, he will be available through my website along with all of the other pieces I'm making during this challenge. Today I wanted to start combining some of the techniques and ideas that I've been using for the previous few days. I had a little bit of a false start with this one. When I first made the body, it felt a little bit too small, so I scrapped it and went bigger. Once I'd refined the shape and was happy with how everything was looking, I moved on to the handles. For this piece, I knew immediately that I wanted to have 4. There's something pleasing about having these different levels on each face of the piece, that no matter which way you turn it, there's always some sort of texture there. Once they were all secured and looking good, I then went ahead and cut out an opening. For this one, I wanted a super short neck, so I tried something new. Instead of making a really tiny cylinder and sticking that on, I instead cut out an opening from the body and pinched up a lip directly from there. As I was finishing this piece up, I felt like it still needed a little bit more embellishment to balance things out. The gaps between the handles just felt a little bit too empty. So I added 4 tiny little stamps or medallions, which you might recognise from last week. I really love how this one turned out. It feels a little bit Mediterranean with these tiny stamps that very much remind me of little tiny seashells. There's something about the shape of the body that I've been playing around with all week that's not only pleasing to the eye, but really pleasing to the touch too. It nestles so nicely in the curves of your palm, partly because it's so small, but also because of this nice gradual curve. So day 26 was no exception, and I carried on with this silhouette. For this one, I decided to go for a tall and thin neck to complement the roundness of the body. Once I'd pinched out my lip and added some handles, I decided to add some texture. I knew I wanted to add some fluting, but I wanted it to be a little bit wider than the fluting I've done previously, which always looks a little bit more Grecian. So for this one, I used my loop tool, which gave me a nice wide stroke. Initially I wanted something really neat and uniform, but I quickly realised because I was trimming it when the clay was still quite wet, I was almost ripping it rather than carving through the clay. But I actually really liked this effect. I think tomorrow I'm going to try and carve the entire piece, not just the bottom half, because this guy looks great, but I'd love to push it further. So, on day 27, I cracked on and made that lovely curved body that I've been making all week. I made the walls slightly thicker this time because I knew I was going to be carving in. Once I was happy with the basic shape, I'd cut out my opening and added a little foot at the bottom. I then got to carving. I decided to follow the contours of the piece and keep everything really rough. I quite enjoyed the unevenness of yesterday's work, so I wanted to push that further. Then it came time to add the handles. I made these super chunky this time because I knew I wanted to carve those too. Smooth handles just looked really weird on this piece. This little vase looks great. I can't wait to glaze this one and see how that glaze reacts to the uneven surface. I'd love to see some colour changes on the ridges or maybe some pooling in the lower areas. I'm super excited, I just can't wait for this one. For day 28, I decided to take a little break from the shape I've been working with all week, and instead I turned it upside down so it was bottom heavy. So once I joined my 2 halves and added my neck, I then trimmed it down a little bit, pinched out my lip, and moved on to the handles. Again, I wanted something different. Initially I went for some Grecian looking handles that you'd see on amphora, but in the end I decided to push the half circle handles that I've been working with all week. They look really fun, but I'm a little bit worried that these might chip off really easily. They're so delicate. For this piece I had to use a thimble to hollow out the bottom as the base was so wide. And then once it was done, I was tempted to finish here, but I thought I'd try some more carving. I started off carving away in the same way I'd been doing for the last 2 vases, but then I thought, why not try something new? So I went for some smaller strokes instead, and it came out with quite an interesting surface. Again, I'm hoping that the glaze will have some cool reactions with this one. I'm not quite sure how I feel about this little vase. He's alright, but I guess when you're making 100 vases, they can't all be winners. And that is week 4 finished. This week was really satisfying. I got to learn some new things and discover some new shapes that I really love and would really love to take further. I've got... maths is not my strong suit. I've got 72 more minis left to make, and I really hope you join me on this journey. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please make sure to like and subscribe if you don't want to miss next week's.